It's time for episode 2 of The GOAT, courtesy of Game On Wisconsin. Hit it. What is up, Packers fans? Welcome to episode 2 of The GOAT. I'm Ryan Bowman, courtesy of Game On Wisconsin. I'm joined here by my friend Mark Beech. Mark, how the heck are you, man?
I'm good, Ryan. Thank you very much. It's good to be here again.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining us. I know, Mark, you've been fighting a cold for the past week, so Mark's putting on his warrior paint to come talk some Packers history with us. You can always follow me at Ryan Bowman _PWW, and you can follow Mark on Twitter as well at Mark Beech 2.0. So last week, Mark, we talked about the obvious Lambeau era. That was a great way to start this series off. Chatted about the period of time between 1919 and 1939. We identified some of our nominees for the greatest of their era. And I think we settled on Don Hudson and Johnny Blood, and obviously Curly Lambeau as a contributor there as well. So in this episode, we are going to rip through the 40s and the 50s, which a bit of a different era, lots of interesting stories to go through there. But I thought maybe we could start with your book, and you're the author of The People's Team, an illustrated history of the Green Bay Packers. I got my copy right here. Make sure you guys get that out there too. You can see the link up on the ticker on the bottom. Make sure you go get that. It's an amazing read, tons of amazing images. All the images we're going to look through here today are courtesy of Mark's book. So thank you for providing that as well, Mark. And maybe just talk about what inspired you to write this book and what made you want to take this journey down through history.
Well, I've been looking for another book idea for a couple of years, actually. I wrote a book that came out in 2012 called When Saturday Mattered Most. It was all about the Army football team in 1958, which was like the last great team Army ever had. They were undefeated. They beat Notre Dame. They had a Heisman Trophy winner. They were number one for a few weeks. No Army never reached that pinnacle ever again. And I liked it, but I was looking for another book idea, and I just didn't have any for the longest time, and it was getting a little frustrating. And then probably too late, I noticed that the Packers were set to turn 100 in a few years, right. Which I was astounded by. And from what I could tell by looking around and asking around and investigating and stuff, was that nobody was really working on a book to commemorate their centennial. So that's where I first came up with the idea to do it. I had a suspicion in the back of my mind that the Packers were a special team. I mean, you always hear this stuff about how they're the only fan-owned team, and they're the only they're from the smallest market in professional sports. But it really is true. I mean, that was the gratifying part of the project, was to find out how much the Packers are a part of the people in the land in Green Bay. It's that they're defined by the Fox River. East versus West, which is a rivalry between the two high schools that gave rise directly to the Packers, turned Green Bay into kind of a football mad city in the first place. And the Packers of all the NFL small town teams, and the Packers have always been from the smallest town in the NFL, except for a few exceptions in the 20s. The Packers were able to survive. And it really, it's an amazing story. Cliff Crystal, was a Wisconsin journalist for a long time, and he's a team historian now. Says that it's the greatest story in sports, and I really think he's very right about that. There's so many. This is a team that could barely get by, if not for the people of Green Bay. They sold stock to save the team. The team was sued into bankruptcy by an angry fan at one point. It was, and then they were saved by those same fans years later. It's such an interesting thing, and I think that the relationship between the team and the town has sort of flipped a little bit. There's nothing small town about the Packers very much anymore. But that's the connection is still there.
Well, absolutely, and we talked a lot about that in episode 1, and just that relationship between the town, how that catalyzing moment, that galvanizing moment where, the town started to support the team for the benefit for Rigney Dwyer, and I think there's a ton more to explore as we get into the 40s and the 50s. So with that, I mean, we ended kind of with Curly Lambeau last episode, and he's definitely one of the ones that carries through right into the 40s. So, I mean, when you showed me this image and when I saw it in the book, like, it is one of the best images that I saw in your book. Just that's Curly Lambeau just walking down the sideline, stoic, the hat, the everything, the composition. So maybe tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here and this particular period of time for Curly Lambeau.
Well, I mean, he's a dapper guy there, and then Curly was getting that reputation. The 40s was really the beginning of a change in the relationship between Curly Lambeau and Green Bay.
Right.
Sometime in the 40s, he divorced his second wife late in the 30s, and in the early 40s, he started dating a woman named Grace Garland, who'd been the ex-wife of Gregory LaCava, who was a Hollywood director. And he married Grace Garland eventually, and moved out to Hollywood. When he wasn't in Green Bay in the fall, and the early winter, he was in Hollywood, hanging out at Brown Derby and all that stuff. He wore fancy suits. He wore cologne. He drove expensive cars. He was just he was the big cheese in Green Bay, and really the NFL. And he had the nickname the Earl of Hollywood, which replaced the Bellicose Belgian, which was his nickname in the 20s and 30s. But the 40s was really the beginning of a change in the relationship between the town and the man, who was not so much small town anymore, not very it was starting to go south. People were getting a little tired of Curly's act.
Yeah, and there's a half-life when it comes to these relationships in football. I've heard some adages of a coach has about a 10-year half-life in today's NFL before the message starts to get stale or some of those things start to kind of grind people the wrong way. And no different for Curly Lambeau. But before that happened, we had some things to celebrate in the 40s, and this image was just kind of really, I got a kick out of it because you can just see the joy on everybody's face after this 1944 championship victory.
Right. He was, that was really the last great Packers gasp of the Packers before things started to turn the wrong way. They had Ted Frisch, who is number 64 in this picture, was the star of that game. He scored, I think, 2 touchdowns. But it was wartime football. So the Packers had Frisch, they had Hudson, and they beat the Giants, and it was it's a championship. I think it's always had to be a little bit of an asterisk because wartime football was like the NFL was decimated by World War II, and there was the Steagles at one time. There were the teams combined and formed because there just weren't enough players to go around. The Packers had a guy playing for them that I found in my book. Who had played high school football in Texas and was always rumored to be playing at Texas Tech or the University of Texas, but he never actually played college football. And I think when Lambeau found him, he was playing semi-pro in California, but I couldn't confirm that even. But he wound up making the Packers, and there's just no way he would have ever played for the Packers if there hadn't been a war on. And what's interesting is he stuck around after the war. He kept playing for the Packers when the war was over. There was a lineman. I can't remember his name, but they found a lot of guys who wouldn't otherwise be playing pro football to play for them.
Well, and we kind of touched on that last episode when we were talking about some of Don Hudson's godly stats in the wartime football era, and we'll get to that in a little bit too. But definitely one of my favorite images here as well. Just like I said, you got Ted Frisch getting hoisted up there, hero of the game. Pretty cool story behind this one. And then tell us who we're looking at here. We've got a few notables just crouching down, listening to what Mr. Lambeau has to say.
So that is from left to right. That's Tony Canadeo, Irv Kump, Curly Lambeau, and Don Hudson, who were, I think the big players for the Packers in the 40s. Canadeo, obviously a Hall of Famer. Yep. But one thing that the Packers had to do after Cecil Isbell abruptly retired in 1942, after that season, one thing the Packers had to do was find somebody who was going to throw the football. Not a totally easy thing to do, to just find somebody like that, especially during the war. So Canadeo handled that mostly, but then he had some dalliances with the Army and going away and stuff. And I don't think he played in the 44 championship game. So Irv Comp actually he was from Milwaukee, had one eye, had a glass eye from I want to say childhood illness. But Irv Comp took over the passing duties because somebody had to get the ball to Hudson. And I believe this is on the field at Rockwood Lodge, which we're going to talk about in a little while.
Yeah, and there's some pretty interesting stories behind Rockwood Lodge and its impact and its historical significance for the Packers, and we'll definitely touch on that in a little bit here, actually right next. So here's a nice aerial view of Rockwood Lodge, and as you kind of explained to me the other day, it's kind of a little bit of an unknown piece of Packers history, but a fairly important one. So maybe walk us through, what
Sure.
Rockwood Lodge meant to the Packers.
So it was about 20 minutes. I think there's a park there now. It's about 20 minutes northeast of the city, on the shores of Green Bay. That's Green Bay right behind it at the top of the picture there.
Right.
And it had been a place that had been built as a social club for an organization in Green Bay that couldn't keep it going, and so they abandoned it. And the Packers wound up buying it in 1946. Lambeau bought it. Got the money from the board to buy it, and he purchased Rockwood Lodge to be a all-in-one training facility. It was really, you want to talk about Curly Lambeau being a visionary. It's ironic that the Rockwood Lodge kind of wound up being at the source of his demise, because Rockwood Lodge was really a revolutionary concept, and one that a lot of people would follow through in modern times. It was players lived there, they trained there, they ate there, they slept there. It was all going to have. There are cottages you can see on the right side of the photo as you look at it. There are cottages in the woods there. And Lambeau lived there himself with his wife Grace Garland. So that it was supposed to be. It was supposed to bring the Packers together and make them a more formidable force. But the problem was that Rockwood was constructed on the Door County Peninsula, which is an extension of the Niagara Escarpment, which begins at Niagara Falls and bends all the way up west through Canada. Yep. And drops down into Wisconsin. And it results in some of the beautiful cliffs you see on the eastern shores of Green Bay, including the ones in front of where Rockwood Lodge was. But the field that the Packers were practicing on, which is that field right out in front of the building, was basically a thin layer of topsoil on top of a big slab of limestone. And so it was very hard, and knee and ankle problems, shin splints came to be a problem. And the Packers practiced there for a little while in 1946 before eventually they began to have to bus into to City Stadium and Joannes Park to practice because they couldn't take the punishment that Rockwood Lodge was dishing out. The field was all covered in rocks, and it was like playing on a parking lot.
Yeah, and its legacy was somewhat short-lived in terms of its ending, and it didn't have a very happy ending. So maybe walk us through what happened with Rockwood Lodge. So
in late January of 1950, while Lambeau was out of town at the NFL meetings, I believe in Philadelphia, there was in the middle of one rainy, windy afternoon, a fire began in the attic at Rockwood Lodge that wound up consuming the entire building. There was a family that lived there. That everybody escaped. There were no fatalities, no injuries, but it did burn the whole place to the ground. It wound up in a way saving the Packers because they collected on the insurance money for Rockwood Lodge. Right. Were able to do things like cover payroll and pay to go on road games and things like that. It was important to the Packers that they got something back out of it because Rockwood had become a money pit for the team. They were sinking a tremendous amount of money into it, and the board, the ownership board, the executive board was beginning to usurp authority from Lambeau, which was really sort of not conducive to winning football. Green Bay's always been best when one guy has been in charge, whether that was Ron Wolf or Ted Thompson or Curly Lambeau or Vince Lombardi. That's when they're at their best. And Rockwood Lodge gave the executive board the excuse to start taking authority away from Curly Lambeau and making him account for football decisions and personnel decisions and things like that. But the burning of Rockwood Lodge was really the beginning of the end for Lambeau, because within 2 weeks he was gone to coach the Chicago Cardinals.
Now, when we were talking about this, you had mentioned that there was some mysterious circumstances around the burning of Rockwood Lodge. That there was some rumors that maybe something nefarious had happened there. But maybe walk us through what you think happened.
Sure. Well, I mean, the rumor is that the scuttlebutt was that the Packers had set the fire themselves, which is a good theory. And because they collected on the insurance money, I think even some of the Packers executive members the board members were making jokes about it. But it was not, in fact, the case. I mean, the insurance money was paid out promptly. There was no record of any police investigation. The caretaker of the lodge said that it began as an electrical fire in the attic. They had electrical violations there a few weeks before. And so it's a good theory, but I just, there was a family living there with little kids, and
Sure.
Whoever would have set that fire would have to be willing to commit murder. We're willing to have that be a chance, because if they'd have killed somebody, it would have been murder. But it did not. And Rockwood's in the middle of a big field. We're out at there's a big field from the highway to where Rockwood Lodge was, and to cross that field in the middle of the day and sneak into the attic and set a fire, it's implausible.
I think I'm with you on that one, Mark. As much as I like a good mystery, I think the cards don't necessarily add up to that here, but it's definitely worth mentioning, as part of the story. So
part of the legend, part of the story.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of great little tidbits like this in Mark's book, The People's Team, An Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers. I just shot a link up there for how you can purchase your copy, whether that's a Kindle version or the hardcover version, which I've got right here. Amazing book. And again, make sure you guys go out and get that. So moving on from the Rockwood story, as you mentioned, kind of the burning down of Rockwood Lodge was kind of the end of Curly Lambeau, and that really started not necessarily his demise, but his departure from the Packers. And Gene Rosani is the man that kind of took over the reins for him. So maybe tell us a little bit about him and what he contributed to the legacy of the Packers.
He was an interesting guy. I think the biggest part of his legacy was he set about early on to integrate the Packers. The Packers under Lambeau they'd never knowingly had an African-American player.
Right.
Gene Rosani set about changing that at his very first training camp, or trying to change it, depending on whether the guys could make the team. I don't think the guys he brought in did. He was an interesting guy. He was from I think he was from the Upper Peninsula. He was a Wisconsin or a Michigan guy, but he was a Bear, which, a lot of the Packers fans and Packers people never warmed to him completely, because he was a Bear. But he was also an interesting character. He was the Packers used to take they ended every season with a West Coast road trip out to California to play the 49ers and to play the Rams. And Rosani, was afraid to fly over the Rocky Mountains, and so they took the train all the time. And it would take 2 or 3 days to get out to the West Coast from Green Bay on the train, and they'd stop in these whistle-stop towns in the Nevada desert and the Utah desert, and have impromptu practices, guys throwing the football around and stuff, because Rosani wouldn't fly. It was sort of an interesting part of his legacy. He was a very good guy and a nice man, but he was a Bear, and fans never totally warmed to him. The Packers were losing enough that during his fourth season, they cut him loose.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned those West Coast trips, and we don't need anything to make those any more difficult, right? I mean, the Packers have had a bit of a hard time recently with some of those West Coast
That's
trips,
right.
and they seem to pop up every year on our schedule. So I don't know. Were they ever successful with that kind of model of taking the train and practicing on the way?
No, they never. I mean, they may have won a couple of those games, but it never worked out for them. I don't think they were a bad
Okay,
team.
I'm just trying to look for something that maybe we can give Coach LaFleur with some of those Seahawks, 49ers, West
Right.
Coast trips that we always have to take out. We'll take anything we can. History always repeats itself, right? So,
That's right.
but maybe we shouldn't take a page. If Gene Rosani got cut 4 years in, we should probably move on to bigger and better things. But an interesting footnote nonetheless. Next up, we've got a pretty interesting picture here with a lot of notable characters in there, and there's a pretty interesting story behind this one. So let us know what we're looking at here.
So the Packers were on the verge of going under in 1949. They were losing money, and they didn't have enough to make it to the end of the season. Really, was part of the problem. This was when they began the drive for their second stock sale, or their third stock sale. Sorry, but this was the event that preceded that. This is actually Thanksgiving 1949. This is before the fire at Rockwood Lodge, just a few months.
Right.
And Curly Lambeau he relinquished head coaching duties in the 49 season. But he showed up for this. This was a benefit game played at City Stadium in the snow on Thanksgiving Day. They basically raised enough money to, 15,000 people showed up. It raised enough money to get the Packers to the end of the season. You can see that, a lot of guys showed up in the first row. That's Don Hudson in the middle there.
Yeah.
Next to Arnie Herber. In the back row on the far right, that's Johnny Blood next to Vern Llewellyn. I think that's Levy Dilweg behind him, a great end from the 20s. And of course, that's Curly Lambeau. And there's some other old coots suited up for football.
Yeah.
But the Canadale played in this game. It was the Packers showed up. But this was sort of a thing. This is another incident where the town came through and saved the team, which happens over and over again in Packers history. The people in Green Bay thought it was tremendously important that they have a team. I mean, in the 20s and 30s, it was the businessmen of the town who could see from their travels, like how impressive it was, like to people from outside Green Bay that this little tiny town had a good pro football team. And they thought it was good for Green Bay's image. And by the 50s, by the late 40s and the early 50s, I think everybody felt that way. And so the 50s was really the beginning. And then the stock sale that followed this game was the beginning of sort of the love affair between the people and the team. It was, not so much a businessman's team. It was, kids showing up with their quarter collections to buy a share and things like that. It was a share of stock. It was a change in the relationship between the team and the town yet again.
Well, and hence the name of your book, The People's Team, right? It's and you hit the nail on the head. There's so many examples of the team just being on the precipice of folding, and every time it's the town that comes through. It's not capital investors or a millionaire that comes in and says, well, I'll save the Packers. It's the people of the town that come in. So that relationship.
Until Lombardi arrived in 59, the Packers were on their deathbed pretty much constantly from 1919 to 1959. And it's not an exaggeration, really. I mean, they were sued into bankruptcy. They had to sell stock to save the team. I mean, they had to play benefits to save the team. It's not an exaggeration. It's a miracle they survived.
Well, and I mean, here we are today, and they're one of the most successful financial sports organizations in the world. So, you can thank the local people of Green Bay, Packers fans, because they definitely pulled this team through the mud for a number of years, 100%. And you touched. We got another image here, and this is a pretty interesting one. It looks like we're at another benefit here. Maybe walk us through what we're looking at.
So both these guys were there in the 50s. I mean, it's not, I think it's in a logical spot here. It's that's on the right. That's Jack Vanisi. That's the Packers head scout.
Yeah.
And on the left, that's Scooter McLean. and this is before the '59 NFL draft. But McLean had been an assistant in Green Bay for years before becoming the head coach for one season and one disastrous season in '58. And Vinisi was one of the guys who was partly responsible for finding Jerry Kramer and Forrest Gregg and Bart Starr and Paul Hornung and I mean, the list goes on, and Jim Taylor. The list goes on and on. But they were, in a lot of ways, Vinisi was the engine, the CPU of the Packers scouting unit.
Right.
And Scooter McLean was just he's an assistant football coach.
Well, but I mean, you touched on it, and this is maybe a little bit of foreshadowing for next week's episodes when we get into the Lombardi area. But he drafted and acquired a ton of the talent that ended up being, kind of the prime core of one of the most historic dynasties in all of football. So definitely a noteworthy contributor to Packers lore.
That's right. Vinisi gets a lot of credit for those drafts, but they were always the guy who drafted most of those guys was Liesl Blackburn, who was the coach between Rosani and Scooter McLean. And Liesl Blackburn was responsible for those drafts. So Vinisi might have had a lot of input, but
sure.
I think you've got to give Liesl his due.
Absolutely. Credit where credit's due, right? And you mentioned after Rockwood Lodge burned down that the Packers had to move and start practicing. Actually, no, before Rockwood Lodge burned down, but after they had moved on from practicing, they moved to City Stadium. So this is a beautiful aerial shot of City Stadium. Maybe give us a little bit of the background of, what was significant about it, what was good about it, what was not so great, and what's happening with it today.
Sure. Well, it was built in the 20s, in 1925, and it was a place the Packers have been playing like in minor league baseball stadiums and different places around Green Bay that weren't really totally football places. And City Stadium was built as a football field.
Right.
And it was, for its time, it was good, but it was wood. It was small. I mean, the Packers were sued in the 30s and almost went bankrupt because a fan, the wooden bleachers, like the back end of them fell out and he fell off the bleachers. That was the whole problem. It was just a rickety old place. I mean, it's an interesting place in that, so many Hall of Famers played there. Johnny Blood, Barney Herbert, Don Hudson. I mean, Bart Starr played there. It's City Stadium was, in a lot of ways, it's like, Cliff made a great analogy. Like he talked about, you hear about presidents and Abe Lincoln and things like that, and their childhood and their infancy, and then the City Stadium, that they have the log cabin that they grew up in. And City Stadium is really the log cabin in Packers history. It's where the team grew up. And they won a lot of championships that were not played there. I mean, it held fewer people than State Fair Park in Milwaukee. And so the 39 championship game, the NFL decreed that it be played at State Fair Park instead of City Stadium, which was a horribly wounding thing to the people of Green Bay. But it was, by the mid 50s, it was becoming for want of a better word, it was becoming a dump. And so it was, the Packers had to have a new stadium, had to have a new place where they were going to have to go. The Burt Bell, the commissioner of the NFL, and everybody else was very matter of fact about that. So it was a great place, and it's still there. I mean, you can say that's East High School, Green Bay East High School on the right there in the picture.
Yeah.
City Stadium is still there. You can still visit it. It's an incredibly important place in Packers history, but it couldn't be the home to the team anymore at a certain point.
And so when the NFL kind of put the writing on the wall for the Packers, it's like, build it or you're probably on your way out.
Right.
They decided to go ahead and build Green Bay City Stadium. So, similar to City Stadium, it was an arena built for football and pretty unique in its time. So, but maybe some of its construction and where it was constructed added some fuel and onto the fire of the East-West rivalry. So maybe walk us through a little bit.
It was a tremendous controversy before it was built. The site that they were going to choose to build it on. I mean, a lot of people wanted to build. They wanted City Stadium renovated, and the Packers to stay at City Stadium, which was just not really an option.
Right.
And they had I think the team hired an independent firm, or the city hired an independent firm to like evaluate sites around the area and pick one. And there were editorials in the paper. Curly Lambeau wrote about it. But they picked one on the west side, which is, I mean, this is Lambeau Field right here.
Yep.
And in 1957, they built Green Bay City Stadium. And they built it, Candlestick Park and Milwaukee County Stadium and all these baseball stadiums which are going up in urban areas, these giant erector sets of metal and steel. Green Bay City Stadium was they bought the land from Victor Van Uuwenhoven, a dairy farmer. They bought his pasture. That's Victor Van Uuwenhoven's house in the bottom right-hand corner of the photo, where his son lived for 6 years while the Packers played there. They bought this farmland and dug into the earth bowl. And so the field of what is now Lambeau Field sits below ground level because that allowed them to construct these concrete stands around. They built a concrete bowl, basically, and then they put some, steel girder seating and stuff, some support structures and things to put up bleachers and things. But
sure.
For the most part, it was, the simple design of City Stadium was what made it. I mean, they built it for less than $1 million, which was, even at the time, pretty good. It was like $950,000 or something, and it was just it was a huge hit from the start. It was, it's a beautiful football stadium, and it really allowed the Packers to have a place that like was major league in a place that was still a small town.
Yeah, and I mean it still in some capacity stands to this day, right? So it's definitely a big piece of the history of the town, the relationship, and again throwing some gasoline onto that rivalry between the East and the West. You got to do that at least every generation. You got to do something to keep that going, right? So
that's right.
I'm sure as we roll through this series, there'll be a few more examples of that as we continue along here. So now as we get into the players of who are the greatest of their era, and that's really one of the main goals that we have here. Also exploring the town and the relationship of the people, but we also want to say, when we started this, Mark, it was a lot of talk in the offseason going on about who's the greatest of all time. And, Brett Favre is better than Aaron Rodgers, is better than Bart Starr. And, that just didn't resonate with you and I. And we are of the mind that, players should be rated based on who they played against relative to their peers. So, last week when we looked at the Lambeau era between 1919 and 1939, Don Hudson was pretty much a slam dunk as one of the greatest of that era. Now we are nominating him again in terms of the 40s and 50s as being a great. So maybe tell us what he accomplished in that carryover into the 40s that he deserves to be here.
Well, World War II really changed Hudson's career. He was by far the best receiver in football.
Yeah.
In the early part of his career, and right up to Pearl Harbor Day. But once people started going to war, and once the NFL got seriously diluted of talent, Don Hudson turned into something different. I mean, he set single season records. I got it here for catches, receiving yards, touchdown catches, and points scored. If you want to compare what he was doing, I think it was his 42 season was when he set all those records. Cecil Isbell was still throwing on the ball, I think is one of the keys there. But I mean, he was like Wayne Gretzky or Steph Curry shooting threes or Babe Ruth hitting, 60 homers when nobody hit more than 19 or something like that. It was just, there's just no comparison. And so the war for I think, a lot of Hudson's cartoonish numbers now, I think you've got to be honest about the effect that World War II had on his career. And also, I mean, we talked about last episode that the shifting of him from defensive end to the defensive backfield. They removed that punishment from his weekly life in the NFL. So that certainly contributed to it too. But playing against lesser competition definitely benefited him from a numbers perspective.
Well, and it's kind of an underscore of why we don't want to compare players from the 40s and the 30s and the 20s to players today, because these guys were playing two ways. You know, you got guys like Deion Sanders who are celebrated as these otherworldly creatures that played offense and defense. And it's like, hey, that was par for the course back in this era. This was not something that you had the option to do for your contract. It was, if you didn't play both ways, you weren't playing. And Don Hudson was a guy that I think you started at defensive end, and really wasn't holding up very well. The punishment was getting to him, and that shift to the defensive backfield probably allowed him to extend that career a little bit. But still, you know, nonetheless, the guy is out there playing offense, playing defense, and, you know, find me a wide receiver in today's game that's willing to, you know, put on some defensive linebacker pads and go out and lay some hits. You know, it's a rare attribute that was pretty commonplace back in the day. So with Don Hudson, we'll move on to our next nominee, which is, we kind of touched on him in that 1944 championship picture that we saw, Mr. Ted Frisch. And you know, I love this picture. Again, just the jubilation, and then specifically him, he's getting carried off by his teammates. He's just, looks like he might have had a couple of brews after the game here. You know, tell us a little bit about Ted.
Ted was a Wisconsin guy. He was from a little town in Wisconsin. He'd gone to, I think River Falls, Teachers College, I think it was, if I'm getting that right. It became, I'm going to blank on the name, but he was from a little town and a little school in Wisconsin, and you know, made his way onto the Packers, and was tremendously popular in town. He was just you know, after his playing career was over, he had a long career as the sort of the announcer at their things. When they flew back from winning the 61 Western Division title. And their plane was banking over the runway. Then they were going to be playing a championship game in Green Bay, and the plane was banking over the runway. Ted Frisch was on the radio talking to everybody in Green Bay and telling them he was announcing the Packers' return to Green Bay. So everybody loved him. He was very popular. He was a star of that 44 championship game. Yeah, and he's got kind of an interesting legacy in the NFL. You know, we discussed Lambeau's. He didn't have African American players. He had one that he didn't know about in the 20s named Walter Jean, who, you know, basically lived as a white man, as a not an African American, you know, identified as white, and so Curly never knew, and that was important, because otherwise, you know, blacks were banned in the NFL. There was a soft ban from 34 to 46, and in 46. Coming back from the war, the All-American Football Conference started up, and they were going to have a bunch of new teams, a bunch of new pro teams, and there was a tremendous bidding war for talent. And the Cleveland Browns signed Ted Frisch for $10,000 to be their fullback. And Ted Frisch began to have second thoughts. There was a story in the Green Bay Press-Gazette about his mom saying that she hoped he would come to his senses and play for Curly. You know, that it was not a done deal. And Ted Frisch, sure enough, backed out of the deal and came back to Green Bay. And Paul Brown in Cleveland, who needed a fullback, signed a man named Marion Motley, who became, you know, not only one of the guys who broke there were four guys in 46 who broke the color barrier in the NFL, but he also became one of the great football players of that, you know, mid-century era. You know, just a tremendous runner, and a you know, force of nature. So the Packers, even though Lambeau had an unspoken policy of not employing African American players, they played their own small, indirect part in integrating the NFL.
Well, and that's an interesting correlation, and like you said, Marion Motley ended up being one of the greatest football players of all time, like a man among boys out on the football field. I've seen some highlights of him, and it's pretty apparent that he outranks everybody through physical stature out on the football field. It was it almost wasn't fair. So, you know, you can thank Ted Frisch for, you know, coming back to Green Bay for you know, maybe opening up a door or two for that. So pretty neat history on there, Mark. Appreciate that. You know, next we have Bobby Dillon, who's bit of a unique cat too. Bobby One Eye. You know, I know we had a bit of a hard time getting some images for this guy, and he's a bit of an elusive footnote in history, but definitely worthy of being nominated as one of the greatest of his era.
I think if you'd have asked Packers fans who would go into the Hall of Fame first, Leroy Butler or Bobby Dillon, which safety, they would have said first, who the heck is Bobby Dillon?
Right.
I think they would have said Leroy Butler. But Bobby Dillon went in 2020, and he was a tremendous safety. He played 8 years. He only played on one winning team. He was a classic great player on a bad team.
Yep.
Drafted in 52, started playing for the Packers in 52. He was Gene Ronzani's find. And he, in his 9-year career, he intercepted 52 passes, which was the most in the NFL, the second most in the NFL at the time. He was actually, the last year he played in Green Bay, Vince Lombardi's first season, he played alongside another safety named Emlyn Tunnell, who had come over from the Giants. And Tunnell was actually I think he'd intercepted he'd started playing in 48, but he'd intercepted 74 or 75 passes by that time. Bobby Dillon was a tremendous player. He was another guy who he had a glass eye. He had a childhood accident. He had one eye, but it didn't keep him from being a great interceptor of the ball and also a great return man. I was reading something in the Green Bay Press-Gazette that he was unmatched at basically arranging the blocking ahead of him when he was trying to return that football from an interception. A great player and kind of a forgotten player. I think it's tremendous he got his Hall of Fame due because he's just another reminder that the Packers have had an inordinate amount of great players pass through Green Bay, and Bobby Dillon was one of them. And because of the teams he played for, he was on the verge of being forgotten, and nobody should.
Well, what's with the eyes? Is there an overly eye issues in Green Bay? That's 2 players now that we've talked about that have one eye.
It was just life was a bit harder and harsher back then. I mean, there was a guy on the first Packers team, a back, and I'm going to blank on his name, but he had one hand. He got in the farm accident as a child, and he lost a hand, but it didn't keep him from playing in the NFL or for the Packers in 1919 and 1920. Gustav Rosenau. But yeah, it was a tougher time.
If you might be able to make the argument that players today are bigger, stronger, faster, but I don't think you can make the argument that they're tougher. Absolutely not. I think the grit that some of these guys exhibited, one hand, one eye, out there slinging in the mud, playing football. I mean, you don't see that nowadays. So it's pretty interesting when you the contrast between the players between these eras. So we mentioned him before, Tony Canadeo, and definitely one of the Packers' greats. Where is this image taking place? Looks like we got a full crowd in the background.
Who are they that's LA in 1949.
Yep.
Canadeo, that's towards the end of his career. He benefited late in his career. Curly Lambeau was one of the last in the NFL to adopt the T formation. And even when he adopted the T formation, he didn't fully adopt it. Lambeau was famous for running the Notre Dame box, where his left halfback was his primary passer for years. I mean, that was his thing, and it was just it was an antiquated offense in 1944. Really, the Bears had great success with the T, and it emphasized the running game and running backs, and it gave Canadeo a kind of a second life to his career. He had great rushing statistics in the mid to later 40s. I think he retired as the NFL's all-time leading rusher, which didn't last long. But between him and Art Hinkle, the Packers were a running team. Canadeo was a great player, the gray ghost of Gonzaga. He was a Chicago boy. He'd gone to play at Gonzaga, and I think he played for one of Lambeau's Notre Dame connections. I think he played for one of the quarterbacks at Notre Dame, back in the 20s. And that guy told Lambeau about Canadeo, and Lambeau drafted him, and the Hall of Fame was coming up.
Lots of Notre Dame connections there too between the Green Bay Packers. We've already touched on a few in episode 1 and 2, and I'm pretty sure there's more to come as we roll through. So Tony Canadeo, definitely one of our nominees for the greatest of the era. Moving on, we've got Bob Mann, and we touched on Marion Motley and his significance in breaking the color barrier for the NFL. But Bob Mann had a pretty big piece of that in Packers history. So maybe touch on that, Mark.
Bob Mann had a great. He'd started in Detroit playing for the Lions, and he played great as a rookie. And the Lions began to de-emphasize his role in the offense. And he was out of football for a little while when the Packers signed him in November of 1952. And he actually was a tremendous player. And he was a good player for Green Bay for a couple of years. But he was their first above-board African-American player. I mean, we talked about Walter Jean before, but Bob Mann was the first that Green Bay knew about, an African-American player. Cliff Crystal, actually, working with a couple of pro football researchers, was the one who found Walter Jean's info. But Bob Mann was a really fast, small guy. He was from South Carolina. He was a tremendously interesting man. And he was the Packers' first black player.
Which is a super important step in the right direction, right? I think it's something that we look back on and you say, wow, like I can't believe there was a soft ban against African American players, but it was a real thing that the league, that the owners, we're all kind of unified in not doing that. So as progress started to show its face around the country, guys like Bob Mann were finally given the opportunity. And then when you look at the NFL today, it's dominated as some of the best players in the league being African American.
Well, the NFL, that they never, nobody ever got together and made a policy. There was no ban, there was no agreement. It just seemed to be but oddly enough, it began I think it was 33. Blacks who'd been tremendously important in the early history of the NFL. Fritz Pollard, probably the biggest star of his day, in the late teens and early 20s. But for 13 or 14 years, there were no blacks in the NFL at all. It's glaring. It's between you and me, Ryan. It's not a coincidence.
No,
this doesn't all happen at once. But there's nothing written down. There was no official record of it, and so they can always say, "Well, it was not not an official ban, not an official policy."
Yeah, it doesn't have to be in writing. I mean, I'm not a man that I'm a skeptic at heart, so I don't believe in coincidences per se. Right. But I think actions speak louder than words or writing at times, and it's pretty like you said, it's pretty glaring that portion of history. And
Bob Mann. Lambeau never had a black player that he knew of play for him when he was when he was in charge of the Packers, and when he went to the Cardinals in Chicago, he didn't have any black players there either for 2 seasons. So it's not actions do speak louder than words. You're right.
Absolutely, and as we kind of roll into episode 3 coming up next Thursday on the Game On Wisconsin channel, we'll talk about one of the coaches that had a very different view, right? Very, very progressive view. But we'll save it. We got some tidbits for you. We're gonna take you on that journey next week. So moving on from Bob Mann, we've got a really, really cool image here. Tobin wrote one of the Packers greats, and Chuck Noll midair trying to get him, like, tell us what this game is from, and maybe touch on Tobin's significance in Packers history.
I think this is 1955 at Municipal Stadium in Cleveland. And I just when I found this picture, I completely forgot that Chuck Noll had a career in the NFL before his coaching career. I only knew him as a coach of the Steelers when I was a kid. But that's Chuck Noll, in midair trying to make a tackle of Tobin Road, who was a running quarterback, but also a good passer. Won a title with Detroit, I think, after he left the Packers in the late 50s or in the mid 50s. Rowe was a good player, another good player on bad teams. When he got to the Packers, he was young and a bit wild. But he settled into, he was a terrific player, and probably one of the better Packers quarterbacks of the era. But they didn't have anything around him.
Yeah, and the thing I love most about this image is just in the absence of a lot of the live action shots that, fans of our era are used to. This you can see what's going on in this picture. This speaks of action and the violent attempt for Chuck Noll to take down Tobin. If I had to guess at the end of this play, I don't think he makes the tackle. I think that's a pretty nasty stiff arm there by Tobin. I think he probably breaks it for another few yards.
Yeah, that's a Hall of Fame stiff arm right there.
I think so. Absolutely. Moving on, this was one of my favorite players in Packers lore, and truthfully, one of my favorite images in the book. Like just the beaten up helmet, the mud all over his face. I mean, Jim Taylor, one of the best of all time in terms of not just the Green Bay Packers, but in football in general, I would say. So, maybe if we can talk about a little bit what brought him to Green Bay and what his legacy in Green Bay was like.
Well, I mean, he was brought to Green Bay in the draft. He was one of many of the stars of the dynasty of the '60s who began his career in the '50s and was
Right.
drafted in Green Bay in the mid to later '50s. Tough, hard-nosed, just a punishing runner. And he was, his stats are, I think he and Paul Hornung, the Packers had the best running game in the NFL when they won their first 2 championships. And it's because of the offensive line that Lombardi built, but it's also because of him and Paul Hornung.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's when you look at his face, like I see a guy that's like, he kind of looks like, a grandpa that has that old man strength that you do not want to mess with, right? Like he just, I would, if Jim Taylor was coming at me downhill, I ain't making that tackle. I'm going to go for his feet 100% every time.
Like
Absolutely. Just punishing, right? When we talked about, bigger, faster, stronger, not equating to the toughness of these guys, I think Jim Taylor's a guy that kind of embodied the era of toughness, and I just love everything about him. But I could talk about Jim Taylor all day. Well, we've got other players we want to get to, so I'll move on. And this is a pretty good image that kind of highlights a few of our favorite players and our nominees as greatest of their era. So we've got Jim Ringo, Jim Taylor again in the center, and another man amongst boys, Mr. Forrest Gregg, who you can see by his stature, is not somebody that you would probably want to mess with in that time.
Right. They really, I mean, it's, with Ringo and Forrest Gregg, they had Ringo was a great center. Forrest Gregg played both guard and tackle. They had just a tremendous offensive line. This is 1960, I believe, when they were en route to winning their Western Championship and going to the championship game in Philadelphia. You can tell because if you look closely, their helmets have no logos on them.
Right.
So that sort of helps you date the picture because Lombardi hadn't yet designed the G in the shape of a football. But yeah, this was these guys were sort of the focal points of the offense in a lot of ways.
Sorry about that. Had some technical difficulties on my camera there. Apologies, everybody. Very cool that we've got these images with 3 of the greats all in one shot. I love it. One of the things that sticks out to me too is just mud, and more mud. Like these guys, I would hate to be the person that had to do the Green Bay Packers laundry in this era. It just seems like a tall task.
There seemed to be more mud back in those days, right?
I feel like football could use a little bit of mud.
Right.
I know everybody likes their fabricated turf with the rubber pellets and whatnot. It's great for track speed, but man, oh man, could I go for a rainy, muddy football game? That would be pretty cool to see live in my era. Going on to the next, we've got another kind of example of 3 of the greats all captured in one awesome image here. Mr. Paul Hornung, Mr. Jerry Kramer, recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. Jerry Kramer, finally, after a long-standing wait for him, and Mr. Fuzzy Thurston. So talk about them and maybe, what their contributions were in the 50s, but also maybe kind of leading into the 60s as to their significance.
Right. Well, these were all guys again who were brought to Green Bay in the 50s. They were great. They cleared the way for. I don't know when Fuzzy Thurston got there, but I know Jerry Kramer was drafted. I think in the 56 or 57 draft.
Yeah.
Out of Iowa or Idaho. But Hornung was a star when he got to the Packers. He was the golden boy. He'd won the Heisman at Notre Dame for a bad team. And he got to Green Bay. He was a handsome guy, chiseled chin. People loved him. But he had more of a reputation around Green Bay as a good time guy than he is as a football player. And it took Vince Lombardi to really bring out the genius of Paul Hornung, who I think doesn't get enough credit. Taylor had the better numbers, but Lombardi called Hornung the greatest player I've ever coached. And that to me goes a long ways towards speaking to his greatness. He was the golden boy, but in the Green Bay locker room, he was known as the Horn or the Goat. The Goat because of his stooped shoulders.
Right.
Yeah, but he was beloved by his teammates. Lombardi was a fiery guy. He was abusive coach in some ways, but they loved Hornung because Hornung could take whatever he dished out with poise and equanimity, and it made them feel like if he can take it, I can take it. And so he never stopped being a good time guy. He never stopped going out all the time and dating many women. I mean, I think his autobiography was Football and the Single Man, which was a takeoff on Sex and the Single Girl. He was a charismatic guy and a good-looking guy, but he was also a great player and an important part of that Green Bay, the makeup of that Green Bay team. And if you want, he was the ball carrier on the Packer sweep. He was the signature player and the signature play of Vince Lombardi's offense. And so his importance to Packers legend, the Packers legacy is hard to overstate.
And then, Jerry Kramer, I think a lot of Packers fans that maybe didn't know who Jerry Kramer was started to learn about who he was as social media and some of the initiatives to get him into the Hall of Fame, finally well-deserved in there. Definitely one of the best offensive linemen of the era, and a pretty key contributor on maybe one of the iconic plays of the 60s. But again, we're going to save some of those tidbits for next episode, guys. We don't want to give it all to you in one shot. We gotta tease you a little bit there, but maybe talk about Fuzzy Thurston a little bit and why he belongs as a nominee of one of the greatest of the era.
Well, I mean, he was clearing the way for a running game that was the best in football and helped the Packers to two championships. Probably should have been a third in 1960 in Philadelphia. They totally outplayed the Eagles, and just try as they might, they could not win that game. Fuzzy was one of Hornung's drinking buddies. He was a good time guy. He had, I think, Fuzzy's was his place. It was either in Appleton or there might have been one in Green Bay. And so he was, a tremendously popular figure, player with the Packers.
Cool. Love this image too. And again, it just that mud, like you can't even tell what colors these guys are wearing half the time because they're just covered head to toe in mud. You just don't see that anymore. And if people don't know who this gentleman is that we're going to talk a little bit about next, then, maybe they're beyond our help, Mark. But I think Bart Starr kind of embodies what a Green Bay Packer is. So, he was brought to the Green Bay Packers in the 50s, maybe made more of his heyday and his stamp in the 60s, but definitely belongs as a nomination here for the 40s and 50s era. But maybe talk about how he got to Green Bay, the relationships that he had with the coaches, and how he started to put his stamp on the team.
Yeah, he came to Green Bay. He was a Liesl Blackburn find out of Alabama.
Yep.
And he was, I think he started games as a rookie, I think, and this was from a game in 1958 he started. He was, trying to find his way, and he really didn't until Lombardi got there. He was a good player, but not a great player until Lombardi got there. When he became the symbiosis between those two guys was otherworldly. I mean, he was known as Lombardi's brain on the field for good reason. Bart Starr was, I think, just a struggling young quarterback when Lombardi showed up, and the '58 season.
Sure.
I think they tied this game. Was sort of a tremendous victory for the team because they got the tie. But they, this was these were the teams he was playing on. They were just bad teams, and who knows what would have happened if they hadn't hired Vince Lombardi. But Bart Starr was, out of Alabama. He was, had been a star in all sorts of ways, but he was somewhat of an unknown. I believe the Green Bay Press-Gazette on the day he was drafted listed him as Brian Bartlett in their list of Packers draftees. Like his Brian Bartlett Starr was his full name.
Okay, yeah.
The Press-Gazette messed that up, and he was just an unknown quantity, and sort of like not people didn't know he was going to be what he became.
Absolutely, and we've got another pretty cool image here of Bart doing some work on the field, and Mr. Vince Lombardi, kind of foreshadowing how he transformed Bart Starr into what he became during the 1960s era. But where are we looking at here? I know we're talking about 40s and 50s, but we are trying to lead and bring us into the 60s a little bit.
I think that's before a game in '61. It's obviously it's Lombardi watching Starr warm up, but I think to me when I picked it for the book, I thought it just showed sort of like, Starr was Lombardi on the field, and this sort of like embodies that. I don't know how else to say that. Early on in his time in Green Bay, Starr pulled Lombardi. He went into Lombardi's office and he said, don't chew me out in front of the other players. I need to be able to be in charge of these guys. I need to be able to lead them, and I can't have you doing that. And Lombardi always respected that. But I thought it was telling for when Starr became coach. He really didn't deal well with public criticism of his coaching, and I think that's I feel like that is part and parcel of that. The request he made to Lombardi was part of the reason he struggled in Green Bay as a coach is he could never deal with the sort of the criticism he got. But he was by '60 and '61 he turned into as I said, Lombardi's brain on the field, a great game manager. A great, he didn't have to win the games for the team because they had the best running game in football, but he was sort of at the pinnacle of like whatever the Packers were doing on offense.
And you touched on it, that they had the greatest running game in football, and this isn't. We've got a couple of obviously iconic players in this picture, but we felt the sweep and the running game and what really started to define the Packers' success deserved its own nomination of the sweep. So maybe tell us a little bit about the evolution of that play and its significance in the Packers' success.
Sure. It's a play that Lombardi brought over with him from the Giants, and I think probably brought to the Giants from Army, from Red Blake.
Right.
Blake was notorious or famous for drilling a few plays hard. Cadets didn't have much time. Cadets were busy. And so he simplified their playbook and made them run several plays perfectly. That Lombardi, that really made an impression on Lombardi, who later said, everything I learned about preparing a team to win, I learned from Red Blake. And with the sweep, Lombardi had a bigger playbook because it was the pros. But with the sweep, it was a play that he drilled constantly. If you watch, like I watched the '61 championship game, you can find it, or you could find it on YouTube. You can see it, and you can see the Packers. They run the sweep almost never, but they practiced it a lot. And it was the play that they could make go, and teams had to respect the sweep. And so they ran a lot of things that looked like the sweep. They ran sweeps the other way. But the sweep was always guards pulling right, Taylor blocking the tight end, or blocking down next to the tight end, and Starr handing off to Horning, who would run right behind the guards. Always red right 49, and this was the play that the Packers made go, and because they felt they had to, and everybody in the NFL had to respect it. It was just it was it was just a ground game. It was rarely going to go for 100 yards or, a 30-yard touchdown run, but it was a steady ground game. Or it was like when Bill Walsh's West Coast offense came in and they were throwing short passes for 4 yards at a time. That's what the sweep was in its day. It was 4 yards every time.
It's body blows, right? And when you start talking about they ran a lot of plays that looked like the sweep and didn't necessarily run it all the time. It's super reminiscent of even offenses today, where Matt LaFleur's scheme and what he's trying to do today is everything looks the same, everything's married to each other, and it's just the threat of what they can do that actually causes defenses to panic or have to overthink maybe how to stop it. So
much of sports is built on deception. If you think about the fakes in basketball, like the ball fakes and things like that, or in baseball, the goal for pitchers is to make every pitch look the same, so that the hitter doesn't know what's coming at him until it's upon him. And that's what it is in football. It's like you don't want people to know what you're doing until you do it. And that's what the sweep was in the Packers offense was in a lot of ways, was making everything look very much the same. Off of that, they could run several different effective plays, one of which was the sweep, the play that came to define an era. And I just love this picture because that's Horning in action. And with credit, it embodies so much that was great about
absolutely
the team and the era.
Iconic image, and so many of those, again, in Mark's book, The People's Team, An Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers. Again, we've got that link up in the chat. Make sure you go and grab your copy, whether you're a hardcover purist like myself or you're a Kindle guy. We've got you covered there, so make sure you go and check that out. So I know we've talked about a lot of players here, and this is the hard part, Mark. This is where we've got to really boil it down, and we've got to make some decisions here. So we've talked about a lot of different nominees, but if you've got to go and you've got to put your hat in the ring for one guy, who is your greatest of the era?
My greatest of the era, and he didn't become great until the 60s, but it would have to be Paul Hornung. He just I don't think people in Green Bay appreciate how great he was. He set an NFL scoring record in like 1960, I think, that wasn't broken for almost 50 years. LaDainian Tomlinson finally broke it.
Yeah, that's crazy. I watched him break that record. Like that right. Blows my mind.
And Hornung did it in like 12 games. Like it was crazy. He was the kicker, and he was a good kicker, but he also had a nose for the end zone and scoring touchdowns. It was unmatched, and he really, like, the sweep was a perfect play for him because nobody was better at Lombardi's run to daylight philosophy than Paul Hornung. In all sorts of ways, he was to me, he was the best. He's one of my favorite Packers of all time, just for the kind of man he was and the kind of teammate he was and the kind of player he was.
Well, I can't really argue with you there, Mark. I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think we both agree Hudson probably belongs here as a nominee as well, in terms of, his carryover from the Lambeau era into the kind of the roaring 40s and 50s. Yeah, cannot be denied. I mean, the man was, like I said, a god amongst men. But if I'm going to bat, if somebody's putting a gun to my head and say pick one, I'm picking Jim Taylor. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. If they were watching earlier on, I had to restrain myself from going on a 10-minute tangent about Jim Taylor. The guy was just tough. I mean, he beat out Jim Brown for the rushing title. He right. went 4 championships, 5 straight Pro Bowls. Like the guy was the epitome of a tough football player in an era where toughness was pretty much everywhere. And he was tougher than everybody else. So he's my guy. I'm going to go to bat for him and say Jim Taylor. So hey, right. You can't go wrong with Jim Taylor. So, as we kind of wrap up episode 2 here, we've got our GOAT selections. We just lost our screen share. Sorry about that, guys. We've got our GOAT selections of Curly Lambeau in the first era, along with Don Hudson, and we also had Johnny Blood. And then for episode 2, our nominees are going to be, again, Don Hudson showing up, And then we've got Paul Horning and Jim Taylor. So next episode, we are going to be ripping into the 60s and the Lombardi era, which I think a lot of Packers fans are going to be excited about. Lots of success to talk about there. And we also have a special guest that's going to be joining us to break down some of the offense. So I'm not gonna throw it out there. I might tease it throughout the week who's going to be joining us, but Packers Blogosphere will be very excited to know who's coming on, and we'll try and announce that throughout the week. So make sure you're checking it out. Make sure you're following Game On Wisconsin on the YouTube channel. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We've got way more stuff to come. You can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Bowman _PWW. And you can also follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Beach 2.0. Mark, this has been super fun again. Super appreciate you coming on and toughing it out while you're sick. We're talking about an era where tough football players, you suited up, you did them proud. So really appreciate it, man. Until next week, I'm excited to talk about that Lombardi era. But for Game On Wisconsin, I'm Ryan, he's Mark, and we're out. Go Pack Go.